A German shepherd barks at the rubble after the earthquake, as people run there, crying. 3 days after the earthquake, the Sugaring region of Myanmar lay in ruins. Piles of broken brick were scattered everywhere, and hazy dust billowed from the shattered concrete. The dry, acrid smell of plaster mixed with the faint scent of human bodies hung heavy in the air. The wail of rescue sirens echoed intermittently, punctuated by the desperate calls of survivors and rescue workers searching through the collapsed buildings. Everything seemed ripped apart, leaving behind a landscape of death. Sergeant Jack Miller stepped through the wreckage, his boots coated in cement dust. His eyes were focused downwards, not out of exhaustion, but to concentrate on his observations. His ears were strained, listening for the slightest sound, a groan, a rustle, any sign of life. Beside him, Jagger, a grey-furred search and rescue dog, stayed close to his heels. Its wet nose scanned the ground, its ears perked up, ready to detect what humans could not. The two of them, man and dog, moved in sync, like a pair familiar with each other after hundreds of hours of training and countless missions. That morning, a fellow member of the rescue team had handed Jack an updated list of victims. He took the paper, his eyes scanning the names written in black ink. At the 17th line, he stopped. Sarah Thompson, 32 years old. Lily, 9 years old. His wife and daughter. The teammate standing beside him put a hand on his shoulder, saying nothing. Jack didn't speak either. He only nodded slightly, his hand clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Then he shoved the paper into his pocket. No tears, no sobs. He turned back, signaled to Jagger, and continued walking. The mission was still at hand, and he was a soldier. In Jack's mind, images of his family flashed and faded quickly. Sarah's smile when he came home after a long shift. Lily's cheerful chatter about the sun-shaped bracelet he'd given her for her birthday 3 weeks ago. He pushed them down deep, locked away in a corner of his mind. Crying wouldn't save anyone. Only action would. He looked at Jagger, the dog's brown eyes shining with alertness. It knew nothing of his loss, but it was there, walking beside him like a comrade who would never leave. Jagger was all he had left now, a fragile link between him and hope. Jack stopped in front of a twisted iron gate, once the entrance to a house. He checked the area map in his hand, marking the location as searched. This pile of rubble was the 11th stop of the day. Dozens more awaited. He exhaled, his breath mingling with the thin dust. "Let's go, Jagger," he said quietly, his voice low but firm. The dog raised its head, wagged its tail slightly, then lowered it again, continuing its search. They wouldn't stop. Couldn't stop. The 12th pile of rubble of the day presented itself to Jack like a perfect picture of devastation. A 4-story apartment building, once home to dozens of families, was now just a jumble of concrete, jagged with broken rebar. There were no windows, no roof, just fragments of shattered walls standing precariously against the sky. Dust still lingered in the air, clinging to every breath of the rescue team. The roar of machinery echoed from afar, but here it was almost silent, only the crunching of footsteps on broken brick and the tired breathing of the soldiers. Jack stopped, placing his hands on his knees, wiping sweat from his forehead with his dusty sleeve. The rescue team had been working non-stop for 12 hours, and his body was starting to resist. His hands were numb from digging, his back ached from bending over for too long, but he didn't care. His eyes scanned the rubble, searching for any sign, a piece of fabric, an object, a sound. Jagger stood beside him, ears perked, nose to the ground. The dog wasn't tired, or if it was, it didn't show it. Jack looked at him, nodding slightly as a silent thank you. The rescue team captain, a tall man named Dave Johnson, approached. "Jack, this area's clear, no signals. Let's move to the east side," he said, his voice hoarse with dust and exhaustion. Dave pointed to another building a few hundred yards away, where another team was setting up floodlights to continue searching through the night. Jack nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the rubble in front of him. Something made him hesitate, an inexplicable feeling. Suddenly, Jagger growled, a low, sharp sound coming from deep in its throat. Jack turned, looking at the dog. Jagger's ears twitched, its nose stopped sniffing and lifted into the air, as if it were picking up something in the wind. Dave frowned. "What's up with him? Just more dirt, huh?" he asked, his tone skeptical. But Jack didn't answer. He knelt beside Jagger, placing his hand on his back. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Then Jagger barked. A loud, sharp, decisive bark, different from its usual barks when it smelled wood or cement. This was the emergency signal, the one Jack had trained it for years to recognize. Someone was alive. His heart pounded, as if trying to burst out of his chest. "Jagger, find them!" he commanded, his voice trembling with the adrenaline surge. Jagger surged forward, its front paws digging hard into a large slab of concrete. Its claws scraped against the rough surface, creating a deafening sound. Jack ran after him, shouting, "Dave! Get over here! We got someone!" Dave and 3 other soldiers immediately dropped their tools and ran over. They didn't ask any more questions. Jagger's bark was the clearest evidence. Jack knelt beside Jagger, using his hands to push aside pieces of broken brick. Jagger continued to dig, its mouth emitting urgent growls. Dave, carrying a crowbar, began to pry at a large concrete slab blocking the way. "Be careful! Don't cause a collapse!" Jack warned, his eyes never leaving Jagger. The dog stopped for a second, looked up at him, then lowered its head again, its nose touching a small crack between 2 concrete blocks. Then he heard it. A weak sound, so small that it was almost drowned out by the heavy breathing of the rescue team. A groan. No, a faint whimper, like a child's voice. Jack froze for a moment, his breath stopping. "Do you hear that?" he shouted, turning to Dave. The captain nodded, his eyes lighting up. "Yes, down there, hurry!" The entire team rushed to work. Dave ordered 2 soldiers to bring more tools, while Jack and he carefully removed each concrete fragment. They didn't use machinery, it was too dangerous. It could cause the whole area to collapse. Everything had to be done by hand, step by step. Jagger stood aside, watching, barking short barks occasionally to urge them on. Jack felt sweat running down his back, but he didn't stop. That whimper was all he needed to keep going. After more than an hour, when his hands were bleeding from scraping against the brick, a small opening appeared. Dave shined a flashlight down. "I see her!" he shouted. Jack bent down, looking through the opening. A small figure lay huddled below, covered in white dust. Wide eyes, glistening with tears, looked up at the flashlight's light. A tiny hand clutched something tightly, a sparkling, sun-shaped bracelet. Jack felt his mind reeling. He stepped back, sat heavily on the ground, his hands trembling. "Lily," he whispered, his voice breaking. Dave looked at him, then down at the opening. "Is that her, your daughter?" he asked, his voice full of astonishment. Jack didn't answer. He only nodded, tears silently streaming down his face, for the first time in 3 days. "Get her out of there, quick!" Dave commanded. The rescue team coordinated smoothly, using crowbars and bare hands to widen the opening. Jack regained his composure, jumping in to help. He wouldn't let anyone replace him at this moment. Jagger stood nearby, wagging its tail slightly, as if understanding that its job was almost done. Finally, after 10 tense minutes, Dave and a soldier pulled the girl out. Lily was shivering, her small body full of scratches, her hair matted with dust and sweat. Her eyes blinked, trying to adjust to the light. Jack knelt down, hugging his daughter tightly. "Lily, Lily," he repeated, his voice choked with emotion. He stroked her hair, checking for any injuries on her body. She was alive. Miraculously, she was alive. Lily looked up at him, her dry lips moving. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice so weak that it was almost inaudible. Jack bent down, hugging her even tighter. "I'm here, honey. I'm here, now." He felt his daughter's warm breath on his shoulder, and in that moment, everything seemed to stop. But then Lily continued, her voice trembling. "Mummy, Mummy's down there." Jack looked up sharply, his eyes wide. "What? Where's Mummy?" he asked urgently. Lily pointed weakly to the opening where she had been pulled out. "Down there, deeper. Mummy told me to hold the bracelet tight." Jack turned to Dave, his eyes burning with a new spark of hope. "Sarah's still in there. My wife. She's down there." Dave nodded, though his expression showed some doubt. "Okay, but be careful. This area isn't stable." He turned to the rescue team, ordering them to prepare for the next search. Jack looked down at Lily, stroking her cheek. "You rest now. Daddy's going to find Mommy." He placed his daughter in the arms of a soldier, then turned back to the rubble. Jagger came closer, his nose sniffing the ground again. The rubble in front of him was now more than just brick and stone. It was a potential tomb, where his wife Sarah might be trapped. He turned to Dave, his voice firm. "I have to go down there. Sarah's alive." Dave frowned, looking at the tiny crack between the 2 large concrete blocks. "Jack, you're crazy. This area's about to collapse. A grown person can't survive down there," he said, his voice low but full of concern. He pointed to the spreading cracks on the surface of the rubble. "The weight of that thing will crush everything. We don't have the equipment to dig any deeper." A few other soldiers nodded in agreement, their eyes showing exhaustion and doubt. Jack didn't reply. He bent down, examining the opening. It was just wide enough for a small person to squeeze through, or a dog, like Jagger. He didn't care about Dave's logic. Lily had survived, and if Sarah was still down there, he wouldn't give up. He stood up, put his helmet on and tightened the strap. "Jagger will lead the way. I'm following him," he said, his voice unwavering. Dave sighed, knowing that he couldn't stop him. "All right, But if there's any sign of collapse, you have to get out immediately. I don't want to lose anyone else." He signaled for a soldier to bring a signal rope and a small water bottle, tying them to Jagger's back. The dog stood still, its brown eyes looking at Jack as if waiting for an order. He knelt down, stroking its head. "You hear me, Jagger? Find Sarah. Let's go." Jagger wagged its tail slightly, then squeezed straight into the crack, its grey fur disappearing into the darkness. Jack took a deep breath, lay face down on the ground and crawled in after it. The space inside was thick with dust. Every breath he took felt like swallowing dry sand. The light from the headlamp on his helmet only shone a few feet, swallowed by the darkness immediately afterwards. Jagger's bark echoed ahead, short but steady, like a guiding thread. He crawled over sharp pieces of brick, his gloves tearing, blood seeping from scratches on his hands. His knees slammed into the concrete, throbbing with pain, but he gritted his teeth and kept going. Every foot he moved was a brush with death. The concrete blocks above him shook, dust falling down on his shoulders. A small crack echoed somewhere, making his heart jump. He knew that if one beam collapsed, both he and Jagger would be buried. But he didn't stop. Jagger's bark was all he was clinging to, a faint ray of hope in the cold earth. After 10 minutes of crawling in the dark, Jagger stopped barking. Jack stopped, panting, and listened. Another sound rang out, a soft hiss from Jagger's throat, as if it was trying to attract attention. He shone the flashlight ahead. Jagger stood there, its nose touching a large concrete block, its front paws scratching at the surface. The light shone down, and he saw a small gap beneath the concrete block, just enough for a person to lie curled up. "Sarah?" he called, his voice hoarse. There was no answer. He crawled closer, lying flat on the ground, shining the light into the gap. A shadowy figure appeared, lying still, covered in white dust. His heart pounded as he recognized the familiar blue shirt, the one Sarah had been wearing on the morning of the earthquake. Blood soaked the left side of the shirt, drying into a dark brown stain. He reached out and touched her leg. It was ice cold. "Sarah!" he called again, louder. Jagger bent down and licked Sarah's outstretched hand lightly. Then a small movement. Her fingers twitched slightly. Jack almost shouted for joy. "She's alive. Good boy, Jagger." He turned his head, shouting through the opening behind him. "Dave, found her! She's alive!" His voice echoed in the cramped space, but he didn't care if anyone heard him. He had to get her out. Jack held Sarah in his arms, his legs trembling with exhaustion but still moving quickly out of the narrow passage. Her faint breath brushed against his chest, like a small flame keeping him awake amidst the nightmare. Jagger stayed close by, its brown eyes shining with alertness. He had just stepped 1 foot outside, preparing to hand Sarah over to the rescue team, when a deafening crack rang out behind him. He turned his head, his heart leaping into his throat. A giant concrete beam, broken from the earthquake, tilted downwards, about to collapse right at the exit. There was no time to think. Jack hugged Sarah tightly, lunging forward, trying to squeeze through the last opening, but the beam was falling too fast, its roar drowning out all other sounds. He felt the hot air from the collapsing dust, and in a split second he knew he couldn't escape. Just then, Jagger acted. The dog lunged forward, its grey fur a determined force, using its shoulder to wedge against the corner of the beam. With its last bit of strength, Jagger held it back, creating just enough space. Jack couldn't react. He only heard a hiss from Jagger's throat and felt his body being pushed through. He rolled outside, hugging Sarah as they fell to the ground, a cloud of dust billowing around them. A horrifying boom echoed immediately afterwards. The beam collapsed, pulling down a large section of concrete, burying the opening. "Jagger!" Jack shouted, his voice lost. He laid Sarah on the ground and turned back to the rubble. The beam lay across the ground, white dust covering everything. He couldn't see Jagger anywhere. His hands trembled, lunging into the dig site, his fingernails scratching at the brick until they were torn open. "No! This can't be happening," he screamed, tears streaming down his face, mingling with the dirt. Dave ran over, pulling him back. "Jack, stop! It's too dangerous!" But Jack didn't listen. He pushed Dave away, continuing to dig. The image of Jagger lunging to block the beam played vividly in his head, and then an old memory flooded back. 3 years ago, during a mine collapse, his teammate Mike had used his body to block a rock so that he could escape. Mike hadn't survived. Now, Jagger had done the same thing. "No, can't lose you," he muttered, his voice breaking. He couldn't bear another loss. Suddenly a soft sound rang out, so small that it was almost drowned out by his sobs. A faint, fluttering breath. Jack stopped, his ears straining. He shone the flashlight into the rubble, and between 2 pieces of concrete, he saw a grey fur foot sticking out, twitching slightly. "Jagger!" he shouted, lunging forward. Dave and 2 other soldiers ran to help. using crowbars to pry the concrete block open. After a few tense minutes, they pulled Jagger out. The dog lay still, one of its hind legs crushed, blood soaking its fur, but its chest was still moving. It was alive. Jack knelt down, hugging Jagger tightly. "You did it," he whispered, tears falling onto the dog's dusty fur. Jagger opened its eyes, licked his hand weakly, then closed them again, breathing roughly. Dave patted him on the shoulder. "Get them both into the ambulance. Hurry." The rescue team acted immediately. Jack carried Sarah, while a soldier supported Jagger. They ran through the rubble, heading for the ambulance 100 yards away. The sirens wailed, drowning out the roar of the wind and dust. Jack sat in the ambulance, one hand around his wife, the other resting on Jagger. He looked at his two comrades. One was family, one was his partner, and in that breathless moment, he felt a small ray of light in the darkness. They had survived, even if it was only temporary. Sunset fell over the field hospital in the Sagaring region, painting the sky a brilliant orange. In the medical tent, 3 single beds were pushed together, creating a small, warm space amid the chaos of the disaster. Lily lay in the middle, her small arms wrapped tightly around her mother. Sarah was still unconscious, her breathing more regular thanks to the oxygen tank, her face pale but less pained. Jack sat beside them, one hand holding his wife's hand, the other resting on his daughter's shoulder. Under the foot of the bed, Jagger lay curled up, its hind leg bandaged, breathing heavily but steadily. Its head rested on Lily's foot, as if it wanted to protect her even in its sleep. Jack looked at his family, his heart heavy but also relieved. None of them were unscathed. Lily was full of scratches, her eyes still filled with horror whenever she woke up. Sarah still had a fight to recover. The injuries to her chest and leg were still unhealed. Jagger had lost the agility of a working dog, but it was still here, surviving as if by a miracle. And he, a soldier who thought he had lost everything, now had a chance to start over. He squeezed Sarah's hand tightly, silently praying that she would wake up, so that they could get through the days ahead together. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the blue tarp of the medical tent, shining luminously on the dirt floor. Lily woke up first, rubbed her eyes and smiled, the first smile after 3 terrifying days. "Daddy, can you hear that?" "Jagger's snoring," she whispered, pointing to the dog. Jack looked over, saw Jagger stirring slightly, a small snore coming from its nose. He chuckled, the sound light but heartfelt, dispelling some of the darkness in his heart. He bent down, gently stroking Jagger's head. Its grey fur was still dusty, but its brown eyes opened slightly, looking at him trustingly. "Thank you, you brave partner," he said quietly, his voice warm. Jagger wagged its tail weakly, as if responding. Jack looked up, looking outside through the crack in the tarp. The sun shone on the devastated land, but in his eyes it brought hope. A new day, a new opportunity. He turned back, took Lily's hand and placed it on Sarah's hand. "We're going to be okay," he said, not only to his daughter, but to himself. Outside, the sound of rescue sirens still echoed, but in this moment his family was reunited. With Jagger by their side, they were survivors, not just through the disaster, but through the darkness of despair.